Facilitating the conversation is Josephine Tucci, and I will turn it over to her in just a minute, and she will introduce herself. I'm just briefly, I've been a librarian for a little over 20 years, and I've been in administration for several of those years. And so today we're going to talk about the job market for new librarians from the perspective of both academic and public libraries. So, Josephine?
Hi, my name is Josephine Tucci, and I am the head of our department at the Berwyn Public Library, which is in Chicago. I have been working in libraries as a librarian for almost 18 years, and I just completed my MLIS degree from University of Illinois. It's been a year since August. So I worked in the field for over 15 years before I actually went back to school. And I am going to talk a lot about public libraries. There is some overlap between, or Polly and I have found that there's overlap between the two, but there are also some distinct differences in the job market and the kinds of jobs that are out there. So even though I assume that most of the people listening to this webinar are already in the field of librarianship or in their master's program or whatever, but there are some really good tips through ALA on what type of librarianship you want to do. So if you're still in the process of figuring that out, I highly recommend visiting this link, which unfortunately I don't think we can open it, but it's just through ALA, and it will go through the different areas of librarianship because it is a very broad area. I think a lot of times we traditionally think of librarianship as public, academic, or school, but there are a lot of other jobs out there in information science or helping companies or individuals getting access to information, and that can also greatly affect your job search, the salary you can expect, etc. So anyway, I highly recommend visiting this website if you're still kind of trying to figure out which direction you want to go in. And then of course, the lovely question of why did I become a librarian, which I think is a really important question to ask yourself, even if you're 10, 15, 20 years into the career. I was talking to several of my colleagues and just people I've talked to over the year, and I can't tell you how many people responded with, my mom or a relative was a librarian, and I love books, and all these, really sort of simple reasons. But another one that I think is really important is because being a librarian, you have to have a really strong sense of public service, especially when you're a public librarian, but I think it applies to academic as well, because you are there to help people, to help serve your community, and to get everyone access to information, because there's a lot of people out there that do not have access because of technology issues, income, education, location. There's so many, and it's a real passion and a calling, I think, to be a librarian. And there's a really interesting, this other link, it's bookriot.com. It came up on my Google for some reason, and it was really interesting because there's, you read these articles online, but what's really interesting is all the comments afterwards. And so if you can open this link and look at this like Twitter feed, it's all these different people from all over the country talking about why they became librarians and what motivated them and what's important to them. And it's a really interesting read, and I highly recommend looking through it.
And just a quick note, for those of you who didn't overhear our conversation about the links before we started this conversation, for some reason, the links are not live in this version of the PowerPoint, but when we are happy to send around the slide deck after the presentation, where you will, of course, have live links, or if you can copy and paste these into a browser from the recording as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Polly.
And I've got a message that somebody's not seeing the slides. Is that true all around? Are other people seeing the slides? Only the main title page. All right, you are.
Oh, is it because I scrolled? Maybe you have to scroll, Polly.
Well, I did.
Oh.
And somebody is saying that they cannot see the slides. All right. Well, let's see here. Is that any better? Still can't.
Okay, no, there it is. Go back to whatever you just did. Yes, there you go.
Okay. Very.
I don't know what you did, but you have magic fingers.
So just to recap then, very quickly, this is the first content slide with that link to an ALA website regarding librarianship as a career that Josephine spoke about. And then this next slide is the topic, why did you become a librarian, with that Book Riot link at the bottom there. Mm-hmm. Let's see, I don't know if this is going to make any difference. I still can't click into the link, so sorry about that.
Okay.
All right. And I also wanted to add, I'm one of those people that, librarianship was not the first thing on my mind when I was in college in terms of a career. But it turns out I really do have a calling for it, and I am so very glad that I got into this profession.
Yeah, I did not choose it right out of college. This is my second master's degree. My first one was in museum education. So I worked in museums for over 10 years, but then I had triplets and my whole life changed. So I ended up working part-time at my local library after my boys were born. And it just stuck. There's a lot of crossover between libraries and museums, and it was a good fit for me. But a lot of people will tell you, well, I just kind of stumbled into it, and I think it's a familiar, at least for a lot of people, it's a familiar setting, and you feel like you're doing something that helps people's lives, and which is a big part of what appeals about it. Anyway, so I looked on the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics to just kind of get an overall, a very general overview of what this profession looks like. And I think that this information, although for some may look encouraging, I think the reality is it's a tough profession sometimes to break into, because when we'll talk about that some more. But the median pay, which means, we're taking salaries from New York City and combining those, mixing it all up with salaries from rural Kentucky, and this is your median pay. So you might look at this number and think, oh, $58,000, that's really great for a first-time librarian. But the reality is that is often not the case, and this can depend on a lot of factors. But the median pay of salary is $58,520, and then the median pay per hour is $28.14. For a typical entry-level professional librarian position, it's quoting that you need a master's degree. I have found that is not always the case. It depends on the library, the community, the type of library, the budget, so many factors. But generally speaking, most libraries will not consider you for a professional librarian level position unless you have that master's degree in library science. And then we'll talk more about work experience, because I did a little mini study about the different types of jobs that were out there in my area, in the Chicago area, and work experience was extremely important for even some of the, not total entry-level jobs, but for some of the, basic librarian jobs. So that's a little tricky, and we'll talk about that. On-the-job training, blah, I think it is helpful to have on-the-job training, but it's not required. And it says here in 2016, there were 138,000 librarian positions. It doesn't specify whether those, the screen keeps changing on me. It doesn't specify whether those jobs were full-time or part-time. And I think that's really important to know, especially in the public library area. There's just, public libraries are oftentimes heavily supported by part-time staff. Okay, is anybody else's screen changing all the time?
I think Michelle was advancing the slide.
Oh, okay. All right, and
so
then
maybe give Michelle a nudge when you're ready for her to move forward.
Okay. So, and then there is an article that I think it's the link that the link I provided was for the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, but there is an article, and I can't remember where I saw it now, talking about how there's going to be a 9% growth in professional librarian positions in the next by the year 2026, 2030, roughly. And again, it's all subjective. It's like, yeah, it depends on a lot of factors, but that paints, in some people's minds, 9% doesn't seem like a lot, but in other people's minds, it's like, great, there's going to be a growth. So you have to kind of take it all with all the factors involved. I'm not sure what the employment change is, if that was, oh, maybe that means people going over from one field to another. I don't know, like new to the field from a different, I don't really know what that means. But anyway, it gives you a good idea. Let's go to the next slide. And in terms of actually searching and looking for jobs, I think some of it depends, and Polly will talk about this in the next slide, but some of it depends on the kind of job you're looking for. Like for academic, I think she uses different search criteria or different websites. But certainly for the public libraries, it's good to look locally. In my Chicago area, my library is part of a consortium of libraries called RAILS, Reaching Across Illinois Library System. So that's who we do all of our interlibrary loan with, and their library cards work in our libraries, et cetera. And so RAILS, the website for RAILS, has a job board, and we get emails on a daily basis of all the jobs that become available through libraries associated with RAILS. So it's a really great resource for job searching in the Chicago area. Then on the state level, Illinois Library Association has JobLine. Here's a link to them. And so even though I'm talking specific to my Chicago area, this may or may not apply to your area, whether you're in a big city or in a state. Certainly you should be looking for these similar kinds of websites where you live. And then, of course, ALA has a job board or a job list that's a national job list. However, I do believe that most of the positions probably listed on ALA are at an upper level. They're going to be upper level management or director's positions, just because of the national scope of what they're listing. It really doesn't warrant doing entry level positions. And then whatever university you might be affiliated with to get your MLI, where you're going to get your degree, they should also have they should also be able to provide you help with looking for jobs in library science. Okay, we can go to the next one. And Polly, I'll let Polly talk about this because these are some of the resources she suggests for academic librarians.
And this is where we start getting into some of the differences between public libraries and academic libraries in terms of job searching. In academic libraries, generally we do national searches. Rarely do we do searches that are local or internal or just statewide, for example. And so some of the kind of primary places to look for jobs in academic libraries, in addition to ALA job lists, which Josephine mentioned, there's higher ed jobs, excuse me, and the Chronicle of Higher Education jobs. Now, both of those list jobs or post jobs for all kinds of higher ed positions, and libraries included. So you want to, focus in on using keywords and that sort of thing, because you will find hundreds and hundreds of positions listed in those places, and they're not all library jobs. And then, as Josephine mentioned, the Illinois State Library Association has a job board. I'm in Indiana. The Indiana Library Federation has a job board. So I think most state library associations will have some sort of job board or, job list, email list, something like that, as do state libraries. And so you can check kind of your local association or your local state library.
And it would be highly recommended to probably join those associations if you're able to do so, whether you're employed or not employed, just because it provides resources and networking opportunities that will help you in your job search.
That's a great suggestion, and often the state library associations are not terribly expensive to join. So if you're unemployed is a consideration. Something else that, and this, I'm not sure whether this applies as much to public libraries, but academic library listservs, ACRL, for example, has a number of listservs for college libraries, university libraries, information literacy, et cetera. And all of those lists are pretty frequently post positions, open positions. Okay. Next slide, please.
So I was curious. I did a little, very short, probably not very accurate in the grand scheme of things, but I did a little 6-week study of Chicago area jobs that were posted on our local Rails consortium website. And because I just thought it would be interesting to sort of tally up the numbers over a certain period of time and see what came up. So of the over 150 jobs that were listed in a 6-week period, only 54 were full-time positions and 97 were part-time. Well, that was kind of a sad, this is mostly public libraries. Every once in a while there'd be an academic library in there, I think because we do have a few academic libraries that are small colleges that are part of our Rails consortium. But for the most part, this is all for public libraries. So twice as many part-time jobs as full-time jobs. And this is the Chicago area. It may differ from place to place, but I think this might be, it's a big city, so it might be a pretty good representation of what's out there nationwide. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so of those 54 full-time positions, only 28 actually required an MLIS graduate degree. So we've already narrowed the pool even more. And of those 28 positions, 8 of them required 1 to 3 years of experience, and 11 required more than 3 years of experience. So we've already narrowed down our pool of jobs for entry-level professional librarians to less than 10, which is a little scary. But it's the reality, at least in public libraries. Next slide, please.
And just quickly, before Josephine continues, in academic libraries, it is less common for us to hire part-time librarians. I mean, we do that to some extent, but generally, if we're searching, well, particularly if we're searching nationally for a position, it's going to be a full-time position.
Right, and for public libraries, we don't do national search. Not all libraries do national searches for anything, but if they do, it's usually just for the director's position, unless it's a really huge library that has, an upper level management position that has a huge amount of responsibility. You're not going to see a lot of national searches for public libraries at the entry, never at the entry level. So anyway, but also when I was looking at these job postings, I was looking at salary, and the salary was all over the place, and it depends a lot on your experience, your level of education, size of the library, and your geographic location. So if you work in a large community with a high tax base, you're going to have a really great budget in your library, your salaries are going to be higher. If you work in a community that has a low tax base, even if it's a large community, like in where I work, we have 56,000 residents. However, our tax base is very low. It's a low-income community, and we don't have those. We don't have a budget like the town just north of us, Oak Park Public Library, has a main branch, and it has a main library and 2 branches. It has 10,000 fewer residents than we do, but their annual budget for the library is 3 times bigger than ours. And that's because they're a more affluent community and their tax base is really high. So all of that has an impact on not only what services the library can provide, but what kinds of salaries they can offer, whether they can offer more full-time versus part-time, what kind of benefits they can offer, et cetera. So all of these things are important to think about when you're doing your job search because, well, we'll get to more of that. The support salary staffs in the Chicago area, meaning non-professional, so it doesn't require an MLIS, which of course was most of the jobs listed, pay anywhere from $9 to $18 an hour, which in Chicago is not a very good salary. And they were mostly part-time jobs. All the part-time positions were paid on an hourly rate, even the ones that did require an MLIS. They don't often list them as salaried. Managerial level positions were almost all full-time. Once in a while you see a part-time manager, but that's very rare. And those jobs tend to be listed with an annual salary or a salary range. So you might get, now this range that I have here is not specific to one position, but I'm just saying that the range for managers' positions was anywhere as low as $30,000 to as high as $80,000. However, those higher salaries are almost always for directors' positions. Then there's, in terms of salary negotiation, in public libraries at the entry level, there's virtually no salary negotiating. Certainly not at the support staff level, not at the part-time level, and not at like librarian ones. When, even if you have 1 or 2 years of experience, it's very uncommon to negotiate salary. And in a library like mine, we happen to be unionized, and so there is no salary negotiation whatsoever. Now, for the director's position, or in a really big library with a big budget, the higher up you move up in the hierarchy, the more likely you are to be able to negotiate those types of issues, salaries and benefits, etc. But mostly it happens at the director's level only. And in an academic library, sometimes even at the entry level, you might be able to negotiate for $1,000 or $2,000 when you're accepting a position. And we were given several questions prior to this session today, and one of them was about how to negotiate a salary. And what I would say is that for an entry level, you want to be realistic in what you ask for. Well, at any level, but I think especially at entry level. And so do a little research, try to figure out if you can kind of what the salary range is at that library. That gives you a little bit of an idea maybe of how much wiggle room you might have. And in an academic library, because often we are hiring from out of state, and so the successful candidate will have relocation expenses, you can also negotiate for reimbursement of relocation expenses and things like that, or even additional money set aside for a research fund or for professional travel. So there are ways that you can kind of, get a little more money, even if you don't have a lot of options for salary negotiations. Next slide, please. And so benefits for public libraries, benefits can be a huge perk for what might be a lower salary. But these benefits will vary widely depending on the size of the library you work for, the budget of the library, et cetera, if it's municipal or district, et cetera. So retirement depends on, of course, the size of the library and budget, and it may or may not include a matching employee contribution, Where I work, we have amazing benefits, which makes up for our lower salaries. But we also have a matching IMRF, Illinois Municipal Retirement Fund. So the library will match a certain percentage to what we put in. So that's a nice benefit. Healthcare, larger libraries will usually have bigger, larger budgets. Will have and more staff generally have better benefits with lower premiums, but that's not always the case. For instance, we just hired someone who used to work at the Addison Public Library, which has twice as many full-time employees as we do, and their budget is twice as much as ours. However, this particular candidate, for her family plan, was paying $900 a month for 3 people. Where I work, where we have half the budget, half the staff, half the salaries, I only pay $300 a month for a family of 6. So those are things that you can't ask those right off the top, when you're interviewing for jobs, but they are important things to know because it can impact your actual take-home pay, if your benefits are not that great. And it's something just to keep in mind when you're trying to make decisions about where to work. Vacation and sick leave also varies by library. We have a really generous vacation and sick leave policy at my library. Most do. You might start out with just 1 week the first year, but you'll get personal days most likely and sick leave. I mean, right now I get ridiculous amount of vacation, and I had to scramble to figure out how to use it up in the last month of December. Of course, I say that, and I'll be cursing about not having enough vacation time next week, but usually it's really pretty good. Some libraries will offer tuition reimbursement. So if you are thinking about getting your MLIS and you work full time for a library, you should definitely take advantage of that. It may require you to keep working at that library for a certain amount of time once you complete the master's, but it could easily cut your tuition bill in, considerably, maybe even in half or all of it. It just depends on the library. And then professional development. If you're lucky, you work at a library they have a board of trustees and a director that really believes strongly in this and will send you to conferences, both locally and nationally, and take advantage of all the resources that are out there to help you develop as a library professional. Unfortunately, not all libraries are good at that, but most of them are. I know in my library, our budget is tight, and I can't go to all the conferences I want to, so I have to pick and choose. And for me, Public Library Association is the best, most directly beneficial conference besides the local ILA conference. I don't usually go to ALA. It's just too broad, and it doesn't serve my needs as well as PLA does. Also, and this is not something, maybe everybody knows this, I found out about this later, but yeah, as a public librarian, and this might work for all types of librarianship, I'm not sure. But after 10 years of service as a librarian, full-time service as a librarian, you can apply for student loan forgiveness, which isn't a perk your library gives you, but it's a perk that, you get, anybody's available to. It's a national thing. So that's kind of cool. All right, next slide.
And I've never heard of student loan forgiveness for librarians.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if it doesn't apply to academic librarians or if I just didn't know about it, but that's great.
Mm-hmm.
So for academic librarians, benefits are similar. Salaries might be a little higher in academic libraries, but there's a pretty broad range for entry level especially. But in terms of benefits, similar to what Josephine just described for public libraries, your plans will vary by institution and by state. Some states have their own state retirement system or plan accounts, and some do not. And they instead the institutions rely on, private investment companies such as TIAA. Your institution may contribute outright to your retirement account, or they may require a match. So, you know, if you put in $6,000 a year, they put in $6,000 a year. My current institution actually just outright contributes to my retirement fund, and then I can put additional money into that if I wish. In terms of healthcare, larger institutions may have more options due to a larger pool of employees. The differences there tend to depend on how large that employee pool is. Vacation and sick leave is usually pretty generous in an academic library. We usually start out with about a month's worth of vacation. And my institution, the last probably 3 places that I've worked, we get a set number of vacation days every year, and that never increases, but still it's about a month a year, so it's pretty generous. Sick leave as well is usually pretty generous in an academic library. And most universities do offer tuition remission to their employees and their employees' immediate family. So you, your spouse, your children would all be eligible for tuition remission for undergraduate and graduate courses. The undergraduate tuition remission tends to be more generous, well, pretty much 100% of tuition, less for graduate work, but in at a previous institution, I did finance a good chunk of my second master's degree through tuition remission, so it made it very affordable for me. In an academic library, you would expect to have at least some small amount of professional development and travel funds. And again, that's, you know, as I mentioned earlier, that's something that you can negotiate an increase in that area upon your salary or your onboarding negotiations. Next slide, please.
So what does this little mini study in this conversation tell us about the job market for new librarians? And I will speak specifically to public. There's a very limited number of full-time entry-level professional librarian positions available. It's just the reality. Most professional librarians in public libraries that you may or may not talk to, or that you would talk to or ask, will probably say, I started out working part-time until a full-time position opened up. Public libraries are notorious for hiring within, and people have kind of worked their way up the ladder. I mean, it's not to say that you don't go from one library to the next, but when you're just starting out, a lot of times I would say definitely 80% of the time, well, I really don't know, but it's a lot, it's more than 50. You start out working part-time and hope that a full-time job will open up either at your library or somewhere within your network. There's nearly twice as many part-time jobs advertised compared to full-time jobs. That's just the reality because it's cheaper to employ part-time labor. It's easier to cover service desks when you can have a lot of more part-time employees that you can move around and switch around. Public libraries rely heavily on their part-time employees because of this cheaper labor and there's a high turnover. So you're constantly replacing your part-time employees, either because they need to make more money and work full-time and need benefits, or as if they're a librarian professional, that a full-time job is opened up and they want that career development. But there's a lot of turnover. Most new librarians with less than 1 year of library experience have to start, as I said, with part-time work. And this part-time work may or may not require an MLIS. So even if you have your MLIS, don't turn your nose up to jobs that don't entry-level jobs that don't necessarily require it, because you can still gain experience, work experience, and you can still network and get involved. So don't pass those opportunities up just because you have a degree. Next slide. So the future of the job market depends on who you talk to, but there is supposedly this 9% increase that's coming down the pike. But again, I don't know really if that means full-time positions, if it's and I assume that means for all librarians, not just public or academic. But there's an interesting article in the Library Journal from October 2017, The Future of Skills, Employment in 2030, which really paints a positive picture. Of course, I think a lot of the focus is turning to technology in libraries. So those are skills that if you're shaky on or intimidated by, you should still try to develop them. I'm not saying that everything we do is going to be replaced by technology, but it is a huge component of what makes us successful in keeping up with current trends and with helping empower our patrons. So as I said, there's a lot of different types of librarian jobs out there, or positions that your MLIS degree would be useful for. So the top paying industries are executive branch of the federal government, computer technology, legal services, financial investment services, and scientific research and development. None of which, all those areas are probably more in the private sector, not in the public sector, but you can see already those salary ranges are much higher, even at an entry level, because working for nonprofits just isn't very profitable for the individual. So I think if you are not really tied to this idea of being more traditional librarian, working in a public library, academic library, or a school librarian, you should really look at the other options that are out there, because in some ways, I think you might find there's more job security and certainly higher salaries. But I certainly understand the love. I love working in a public library, and I couldn't see myself ever working in a financial institution or a law firm. But, you have to take the good with the bad when you make those kinds of decisions. And then I think what's interesting is these stats, or this information about where the states that have the highest number of librarians is New York, Texas, California, Illinois, and Florida. And metropolitan areas that have the most librarians, not surprisingly, New York, Washington, D.C., Chicago, Los Angeles, and Boston. And I think the bigger the metropolitan area, the higher the salaries, usually, not always, and the more opportunity there is. And so this link below that is where I got that information from, which will have a lot more information that might be of interest to you. Next slide, please.
And in another Library Journal article from 2017, Placements and Salaries 2017, you can find more detail of salary comparisons by region. And region location is important if you're thinking about relocating and you are comparing salaries and benefits, because cost of living varies widely across the country. Some of those metropolitan areas that were listed in the last slide as being big employers of librarians are also very costly cities in which to live. And so, as Josephine mentioned earlier, you want to take into account the entire benefit package in addition to the salary and the cost of living. College and university libraries hired about 24% of 2016 MLIS graduates. So that's a relatively small percentage in the scheme of things. So as indicated in that previous Library Journal article mention, there are lots of options outside of public libraries and academic libraries that you might want to consider. Experience is important to a successful job search. They talked about, the authors talked about this in the Library Journal article. There's an article in American Libraries in the recent issue about the job search that gives you some useful hints and information. But if you don't have actual paid library job experience, while you're a student, consider a practicum or field work or an internship and campus jobs in order to gain that experience.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody just sent a question about job security, asking are librarians more at risk at losing their jobs than other industries? I would say within the academic world, the answer to that would be no, especially if you're in a tenure track or tenured position. And just anecdotally, I think possibly if you're a librarian in a special library, like in let's say in an accounting firm, or some sort of manufacturing situation, the job security may be a little less because you're kind of at the mercy of the what's going on in that industry sector in a way that you are not in an academic library. And I would think the same would be true for public libraries, that you'd be relatively secure once you have that job. Is that true, Josephine?
I think that, I see we had a library in the Chicago area just reduce their hours because of funding. It really depends. The part-time positions are probably the first ones to go. If you're union, like I am, you're very protected. But if you're not union and you go through some serious financial cutbacks or hardships in your community or just in the nationwide, you're going to. I know that when we went through the recession, we had to reduce some people's hours. That was only temporary, but we did have to do that.
Yeah.
Now that we have a union, we won't have to do that. But unions are double-edged swords. So I think it really depends. For the most part, I would say you don't have a lot of job insecurity, but you can't. You just need to be practical. That things could come up, but generally it's going to affect the part-timers more so.
It's true. Next slide, please.
So it's a lot. Even when you're looking for a job, it's hard to find those. It's hard to find those entry-level jobs sometimes, especially if you don't feel like you have any experience. But as Polly was saying, if you're in graduate school, take advantage of practicums, volunteering, do whatever you can to get some experience, whether you're paid or as a volunteer. And I think working if you're on campus and working at the school library is a great idea. My son is doing that right now. I'm not sure he'll become a librarian, but he's really loving it. It's his part-time job. And so you just have to get that experience wherever you can. And I think, volunteer, not just to work at libraries, but also, volunteer your time on different committees and professional organizations, because it's a good way to network, and it's also a good way that you can, if you were working on a project with other librarians or other professionals, you can claim that as work experience of project management, organization, whatever. You really just want to be a sponge and soak up as much as you can.
And yes, I second that. I had no library work experience when I went to graduate school for my MLS. But I worked at 4 different libraries on campus, got a variety of experience that I then could, highlight in my resume and during the interview process.
Mm-hmm.
And next slide, please. It looks like we're getting close to time.
Yeah, so if you don't have experience, as we were talking about, there's different ways you can try to gain some. That doesn't necessarily have to be on-the-job training or experience, but finding a mentor or a role model, whether it's through graduate school or through just volunteering or working part-time, latch on to somebody who you think would be good at guiding you in your career choices. Certainly use LinkedIn to leverage your connections. All of these were suggested on that LibGig, the link below. Do an informational interview. You could certainly call someone at a library, public library, academic library, and say, I would really like to learn more about what you do, how you got into this, and any suggestions you have for me as new to the career. I can't imagine anyone would turn you down for an informational interview. As I said, join professional associations. This was, I thought, a really interesting suggestion, but was doing service-oriented postgraduate work for places like AmeriCorps or teaching English abroad. You know, I think it's really more challenging for people who go straight from undergraduate into graduate school for MLIS, because you just don't have a lot of work experience in general or life experience. So you need to try and find creative ways to get that. Whereas I think for Polly and me, we were kind of entering into this already having done other things. So we were able to use that past experience, even if it wasn't library related, we were able to apply it to what we were trying to do in libraries, and it worked well for us. Being willing to relocate, I think if you're a new librarian starting out, there's only really in public libraries 2 times where you're going to relocate. Because it's either when you're first starting out and you're just trying to get that job, you know, your first job, or if you're at the higher level and you're really trying to get that really great job of being the head of whatever. But relocating is not a huge thing for entry-level public librarians. You're probably going to start looking wherever you're already living or close to where your family lives or whatever, because you're not going to be necessarily making a really great living wage when you first start out. And be prepared to fail, because you're going to you may apply for a lot of jobs and you may get really discouraged, but you just have to keep at it because your time will come.
And in an academic library, and perhaps it's the same in public libraries, but your cover letter or your letter of application or whatever it might be called is really important to help you relate your experience to the position sought, especially if you do not have paid paraprofessional experience in libraries. So you need to be able to describe what you've done either in a part-time library job or as a student library worker or as a waitress or whatever kind of work you've been doing. How can you take that experience and apply it to the requirements of the job? And you need to do that in your cover letter. You can't really do that in your resume. And so be explicit about how your skills, your knowledge will fulfill the expectations of the requirements for the job. Often in an academic library position, teaching experience is desired. So if you don't have any teaching experience per se, perhaps you've done training of some sort in another position, for example. Maybe you've tutored children, but leverage that experience that you have for the position at hand. And know that if you get an interview on campus for an academic library position, it's going to be at least a full day interview, probably with dinner the night before. So it is, 8 hours of talking to people. So be prepared for that. You might want to do some kind of practice interviewing with a friend, for example. And by doing that, it will help you prepare questions to ask during the interview, because you will be given a chance to do that. And so you want to ask questions that are, actually tell you something about the institution. And at the same time, the questions you ask will tell your interviewers a little something about you. So know the institution before you even write that cover letter. And definitely, if you're going to interview in person or even on the phone, do your homework on the institution so that you have a context for the position. If you're applying for a tenure-track job, you will very likely be asked about your research agenda. So even if you don't have a research agenda, be thinking about and have something in mind when you're asked that question, so you can say, my research interests lie in this area. It doesn't mean you have to have published on that thing, whatever it is. but start thinking along those lines if you're interested in academic libraries. Next slide, please.
I think when you're looking at job listings, you should look for keywords that you can target in your cover letter. I think of cover letters as the icing on the cake. It's your chance to throw in those like little special decorative doodads that may or may not appear in your resume, but your resume has all that rich flavor, and the middle frosting is still in there. So you want both of them to be equally rich, but your cover letter is your chance to kind of embellish a little bit more and go into more detail about things that target the specific job you're applying for. There are different styles of resumes. Do not just use one that lists everything in chronological order. I think a combination of chronological as well as responsibilities, the types of work or experience you have is good. There's so many great models out there that you can look at. Also, you could ask to look at the resumes of people you work with, like a boss or something, and see how they do theirs. I mean, it can't hurt. You should tweak your resume and cover letter for each job when necessary. Don't just send out form letters to everything you apply for. Even if you're applying for all the youth services jobs that are listed in the entire country, you need to make sure that cover letter is targeting each specific job. Research the library and the community it serves. It's not enough to just know, to look on the library's website. You need to know about that community because it's very important. Look at policies, board minutes, anything that's available through the library's website to give you insight into how that library functions and what you might see as their strengths and areas that you could help improve. Prepare your questions in advance. Come up with some questions based on what you've researched. They should naturally come up as you're learning more about the library and the community. And remember, you are interviewing them as well. So it's not just about do you fit in with them, but do they fit in with you? And if you think an interview went poorly, it's not always just because you may have answered the questions poorly. They may have asked questions and say, well, do I want to work for that library if they can't do an interview well? I mean, it speaks volumes. And I think the best interviews are more like conversations than a series of questions and answers. So the more your responses can initiate conversation, the better, in my opinion. And it's always important to have a really good, strong, but a good response for what is your greatest weakness or where do you need to improve the most. Because you don't want to say, well, I'm really messy or I need to work on my tardiness. You want whatever your weakness is to also kind of shine on. It's really a strength, but maybe you're obsessed about, your text messages or something. I don't know. You don't want your weakness to be a real weakness. You want it to show that you really are pretty kick-ass. Next slide. Oh, and then this is just the Annoyed Librarian. I'm not sure who the actual individual who does this, but there's a lots of great comments and topics that is through this blog, through the Library Journal. So I just recommend people checking it out. It's a fun read.
And Michelle, do we have time a little? I know it's 3 o'clock, but there's a question pending. Do we have time to answer that?
Where is the question?
It is over here. Well, I'll tell you what, let me read it. Sorry, I went past it. I'm curious if you have advice for making career changes from other professional industries into libraries. And so I would say, obviously if you're trying to apply for positions that require the MLS, then you want to work on that. And at the time that you're in school working on your MLS, you can certainly start getting library experience in student jobs and that sort of thing, for example. But also think about, depending on what career you're in, what are you doing in that career that could translate into libraries? Customer service, teaching, I'm sure I'm forgetting 100 things. Josephine?
Yeah. I'm trying to find the original question. Just refresh me as to what the specifics were, because I got a little sidetracked. Sorry.
It just says, I'm curious if you have advice for making career changes from other professional industries into libraries.
Okay. Yes. Well, when I made my change, because I did change industries, going from museums to libraries, there was a lot of crossover, which helped me, I think. But I think to test the waters, it's really good to volunteer at a library. If you are in need of a little extra income, there's a lot of part-time jobs at libraries, and they have evenings and weekends. So it's also, try it for 6 months and see if you like the fit. And you really have to weigh the pros and cons of completely switching careers, because you don't want to give up what might be a really stable, though possibly not as fulfilling career choice for something that may or may not give you the same type of stability.
And I'm happy, I posted, I think it went to everybody. You're welcome to contact me, offline individually if you have more questions.
Yeah, same here.
And in January, I believe, the supervisory conversation is going to be about the job search itself. So we intentionally didn't go much into that. We talked more about the overview of, the library, getting into the profession for new librarians, but there will be another opportunity for, to ask, to hear from other people and ask some of those questions.
Mm-hmm. It looks like somebody's trying to speak, but I don't hear them. Denise, if you're trying to speak, we don't hear you. Do you want to chat instead? Okay. Well, overall, I mean, I hope I'm not painting a horribly bleak picture, but, I just think you have to be realistic in what your expectations are when you enter this field. And it's not always easy to piece together part-time jobs, but if you can manage it, it'll pay off in the long run.
Yes, perseverance is important.
Yes.
Well, I think we are at 3:05, so if there aren't any more questions, and Michelle says the slides on the recording will be made available. So there is a survey that will go out to the participants, and so please do complete that for us. And that's all I have to say.
Oh, yes, and Michelle was stating about the loan forgiveness has some very specific requirements, which is true. So it may not apply for everyone, but it's worth checking out.
Good point. And so, yes, one of the participants posted a link with some information about that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. All right. Again, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to talk about librarianship and the job search and all of that stuff anytime.
Same here. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks.